Tonight we're not rushing into noise or clamour. Instead we step into a quieter kind of history, one made of mornings heavy with breath, of footsteps on frozen ground, of lives measured not by victories, but by the weight of routine. These are the small hours of the past, when nothing seemed to move except smoke from a hearth and the slow turning of the sky. Before we wander there, let yourself settle. Find a comfortable place, let your shoulders fall, and notice the stillness around you. If you'd like, you can pause and take a slow breath in, and an even slower breath out. And while you rest, remember to leave a like and subscribe. It helps this little circle of history drift out farther into the quiet night. And if you wish, share your location and the time you're listening in the comments. I always find it moving to see those tiny lanterns of presence across the world glowing together in silence. And now, let us begin. The air was sharp before the sun had fully risen, and the thin smoke of a hearth fire clung to the dampness of the morning. The ground was hard beneath bare feet, even harder when you had been roused before the roosters gave their cry. The Vikings were not kind to sleepers. The day began when the cold forced you upright, and it ended when exhaustion finally pinned you to straw. For those who were not masters of their own hall, comfort was something imagined, not lived. A thrall, the word used for the enslaved, did not wake to the smell of roasted meat or the warmth of blankets. They woke to a hand pressing them toward work, to the creak of timbers above, to the shivering knowledge that their body belonged to someone else. The sun's first rays revealed little mercy. You might have spent the night on a dirt floor, pressed against others who shared the same air, the same fleas, the same thin wool thrown over shoulders. When frost laced itself along the doorway, you were the first to step out into it. A day in a Viking settlement began with movement. The livestock needed tending before the chieftain's family stirred. If the goats bleated, or the cows lowed with hunger, it was your back that bent, your fingers that stiffened as they pulled cold water into buckets. The smell of dung and damp straw mixed with the smoke of the longhouse fires. This was the scent of your morning, less of a beginning, more of a reminder that the day would ask much from you and give almost nothing back. The longhouse itself loomed like a ship stranded on land. Inside, the free folk stretched, rubbed their eyes, and reached for bread and dried fish. You were not invited to the bench beside them. Your meal was taken standing, if you ate at all, a crust softened in broth, maybe a scrap of yesterday's stew if the pot had not been emptied. A hunger carried from one day into the next was not unusual. Even the sounds of dawn carried weight. The grinding of a quernstone as someone prepared barley, the clatter of iron tools, the sharp call of orders in a tongue you might not fully understand if you had been captured from far away. Slaves in Viking lands came from across seas and forests, taken in raids on Ireland, Francia, the Slavic rivers. Some understood their master's words, others learned by pain what was being demanded. A mistake was not forgiven with patience. As the light spread, so did the tasks. If you were unlucky, the oars of a ship waited, heavy as fate, dragging your muscles until they burned. If you remained in the farmstead, there were fields to clear, weeds to tear, logs to split. The Viking age was rich in tales of warriors, of feasts, of gold hidden in dragons' hoards, but it was just as rich in sweat and blood spilled on soil by those who had no songs sung about them. You might imagine that even labour brings warmth when the body is moving, but the North did not always grant that kindness. Wind sliced across fjords, pulling heat away as fast as work could create it. Hands cracked, lips bled, and skin stiffened like hide left too long in the sun. The masters wrapped themselves in fur, but you had only what was given: patched wool, perhaps a cloak passed down through other enslaved bodies now long gone. By midday, the hall filled again with smoke and chatter. The smell of roasting meat drifted from spits. You carried the platters, your arms aching, careful not to stumble. To spill a lord's portion was to risk the back of his hand or worse. The masters laughed, their voices rolling like thunder. You stood against the wall, invisible yet always seen. When their hunger was sated, the scraps became your portion. A gnawed bone, a heel of bread, broth cloudy with grease. You ate quickly, standing, because another task would come. There was no clock to measure the day, only the sun above, and the commands shouted by those with authority. Afternoon was no gentler than morning. Wool needed carding, nets needed mending, firewood demanded splitting, and animals demanded tending again. If you were among the unlucky chosen, you were marched to the smith's shed, where the forge burned hot and unrelenting, your hands blackened with soot. Sparks leapt against skin, but you dared not flinch. The forge did not belong to you, nor did the hours you gave it. The masters sometimes spoke of gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, as though their blessings explained why some were born to give orders, while others carried chains. Shrines rose with carved poles, red paint dripping like old blood. You might be forced to attend a sacrifice, not as guest, but as tool. The animal's throat was cut by another hand, but yours dragged it to the altar. Yours scrubbed away the stains. Yours felt the warm spill of life against cold earth. The people cheered the offering. You stood silent, knowing no god was watching to lighten your burden. Evening drew its shadows long. The sea glistened like iron. The hills darkened. For free men, this was the time of mead, of story, of song. For thralls, it was not time at all, only more labour. Fetch the water, stoke the fire, carry the torches that lit the chieftain's bench. The weight of the day pressed down, but the tasks stretched until the masters decided otherwise. And when the night finally wrapped around the settlement, you crawled back to straw or dirt, body aching, knowing the cycle would repeat. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to imagine the Vikings as giants striding with axes and shields, to imagine their world as endless adventure. Yet the truth of daily life was harsher, especially for those in bondage. A dawn without comfort was not a single morning, but the rhythm of existence. No matter how beautiful the fjord looked in the light, no matter how strong the timbers of the hall, for the enslaved it was a world carved from cold and obedience. And so, as sleep crept in, if it came at all, it carried no promise of rest. The fleas in the straw, the rumble of drunken laughter from the hall, the gnawing of hunger, the dull pain in muscles that had not stopped since dawn. These were the lullabies. The new day would come quickly, as unforgiving as the last. And the sun, rising golden across the water, did not belong to you. The longhouse was the heart of the settlement, though not every heart beat for the same body. Its heavy beams groaned with age. Its roof of turf and timber sagged against the northern winds. And yet inside, it gathered all lives together. The nobleman with his carved chair, the warrior with his boasts, the wife with her keys of authority. And in the shadows, those who bore no names worth keeping. Beneath the warmth of the fire that glowed along the central hearth, shackles rested as quietly as embers, unseen but never absent. For the thralls, the longhouse was not a hall of safety. It was both shelter and prison, a place that demanded obedience more than it offered belonging. Chains were not always clasped around wrists and ankles. Iron was expensive, and fear was cheaper, but the bonds were no less real. A word from a master could command a body as surely as any lock. The walls themselves seemed to whisper reminders of one's place. Dark corners reserved for the unfree, straw laid down near the smoke holes where soot fell like black snow. It was here, among the carved beams and the smoke-stained rafters, that the hierarchy of Viking life announced itself most clearly. At the centre blazed the fire, its heat claimed by the chieftain and his kin. Closer to the smoke, closer to the drafts, the thralls lay. Their tasks were never ending, feeding the flames, carrying water from outside, scraping grease from cooking pots, scrubbing the benches where the free men sat. Each gesture reinforced the invisible chain that bound them. When feasts filled the hall, the disparity grew sharper. Horns of mead passed from hand to hand, spilling golden drops onto carved tables, while laughter shook the rafters. A thrall stood at the edge, eyes lowered, waiting for the nod that meant another refill. The songs rose loud, recounting voyages and victories, but no song told of the one who kept the cups full, who swept the bones from the rushes when the revelry ended. The shackles beneath the longhouse were not only metal, they were silence, erasure, the weight of being unremembered. Punishment lurked always nearby. The walls had witnessed the crack of whips, the sharp cries stifled quickly. A thrall accused of laziness might be struck with a rod, or branded, or worse, depending on the master's temper. The longhouse, with its flickering light, became a theatre where pain was displayed not for justice but for warning. Every thrall who watched knew that their body could be made an example. The fire illuminated not only the carved gods at the high seat, but also the bruises blooming on unfree flesh. Even in sleep, the longhouse did not free its captives. Straw bedding lay thin, crawling with vermin, pressed against cold earth that leached away warmth. The creak of beams above was constant, as if the building itself reminded its inhabitants of their place within it. Masters rested closer to the fire, their dreams softened by furs. Thralls slept with one eye open, ears straining for the call that might wrench them awake. A newborn crying, a drunken man demanding more drink, a cow breaking free outside. Rest belonged to others. Service was your inheritance. Yet beneath the harshness of the hall, other truths lingered. Thralls sometimes shared fragments of language, stitching together whispered memories of homelands left behind. Irish words rubbed against Slavic ones, mingling under the weight of Norse command. They told each other of rivers where summers burned green, of fields that did not frost over so quickly, of families torn apart in raids that came before dawn. These murmurs were fragile, snatched between chores, often drowned out by the roar of masters' voices. Still, they flickered like sparks along the straw, small, easily extinguished, but real. The longhouse also stood as a reminder that freedom was not equal even among the free. The wife of the chieftain held the keys that unlocked chests of linen, silver, and food. These keys dangled from her belt out like symbols of power, a sharp contrast to the empty hands of the thralls. The warriors too enjoyed privilege, swaggering as though their scars entitled them to meat before others. For the unfree, such displays were constant reminders that the chains were not accidental. They were the foundation on which the entire hall rested. The gods carved into the high seat did not break the chains either. Their watchful eyes stared from polished wood. Odin with his one eye, Thor with his hammer, Freya with his fertility. Sacrifices were made at seasonal feasts, animals dragged squealing to the altar. Thralls carried them, bound them, cleaned the gore after the knife had fallen. To stand so near to blood, and yet so far from divinity, was its own kind of torment. The gods feasted on sacrifice, but the thrall only scrubbed the stains from the planks beneath. When the hall grew quiet, After mead had dulled the warriors' tongues and the fire dimmed to coals, the shackles beneath it grew heavier. Dreams, if they came, were rarely sweet. They might carry you back to the raid where you were taken, to the faces of kin you would never see again, or to the ship that dragged you across salt water into a land where even the sky seemed colder. Waking was no escape. The same beams arched above, the same smoke stung the eyes, the same commands would rise with the dawn. And yet the longhouse endured because those bound within it endured. The unfree became invisible pillars, holding up the life of the settlement. The fields would not be sown without them, the animals would not be tended, the fire would not be fed, the benches would not be cleaned. The masters drank and laughed as though their power was carved from oak or blessed by gods. But in truth it was sustained by the shackled lives beneath the longhouse. In the quiet hours, when only the coals glowed faintly red, the truth settled in like smoke. The hall was not only a shelter from wind and snow. It was a cage, built not of bars, but of duties, fears, and the unending cycle of command. The shackles beneath the longhouse rattled silently, binding not only wrists and ankles but futures, binding the rhythm of days into an order that left no room for escape. And when the dawn returned, harsh and cold, it revealed nothing new, only the same fire, the same voices, and the same chains hidden in plain sight. The fire in the longhouse burned low by morning, and the smell of ash clung to everything it touched. Smoke lingered in the beams overhead, mingling with the dampness carried in from outside. The day had not yet filled with its noise, but hunger already pressed against ribs like a restless hand. Food was always the measure of worth, and the thrall's portion was a reminder that survival was not a right, but a concession. The meals that began the day were humble even for those who held power. A round of flatbread made from barley or rye, dark and coarse, sometimes flecked with grit from the millstone. Salted fish pulled from the sea months before, dried to a leathery toughness. But for the enslaved, even this meagre fare was reduced further. The crust too hard for delicate teeth, the heel of bread that no one else wanted, the fish bones picked nearly clean before being passed down. It was food enough to keep a body upright, not enough to grant it strength. The sound of the quern stone marked the rhythm of this existence. Women, some free, some not, knelt over the circular stone-downs, grinding barley into flour. The task stole hours, filling the air with dust that clung to hair and throat alike. The bread it produced was heavy, more stone than grain, but it sustained the haul. Thralls laboured at the grind, turning the stone until their shoulders throbbed, feeding not themselves but the chieftain's table. Only when the baskets had been carried to the mistress did scraps return to the hands that had prepared them. Salt was precious, a treasure carried from trade routes that stretched far beyond the fjords. To cure fish or preserve meat required it, and so the masters portioned it carefully. For a thrall, a pinch of salt was not flavour, but control. It decided how long food could last, whether a winter would bring life or starvation. To eat without salt was to chew endlessly on blandness, to swallow necessity without satisfaction. And yet, thralls learned to endure it, lips cracking, mouths dry, the mineral tang reserved for others. At the longhouse table, hierarchy was written in every dish. The chieftain's family reached for roasted meat, skewered and dripping with fat. Warriors tore at slabs of pork, their laughter booming over the clatter of knives. The women with keys doled out cheese, butter, dried herbs, the fruits of summer's labour. And behind them, waiting, stood those who had carried the food in. When the benches were cleared, only then did the thralls move, gathering what was left, as though collecting echoes. The scraps were eaten quickly, in corners, with no blessing, no toast, no song. Hunger was a quiet torment, but it shaped every movement. A weak thrall could not row a ship, could not haul timber, could not carry water through the snow. So the masters fed them enough to prevent collapse, never enough to grant strength for defiance. This careful measure was its own kind of shackle. Bread became the chain, salt the lock, the portion a reminder that your body did not belong to you. It was maintained like a tool, sharpened just enough to work, but never enough to cut. Even festivals, when food seemed plentiful, carried this cruel arithmetic. At the feasts of Yule or harvest, animals were slaughtered, their blood smeared on idols, their flesh roasted over fires. The smell of meat filled the longhouse until it was thick in the lungs, unbearable in its richness. Masters ate until grease ran down their beards, until their belts strained, until they leaned back with groans of satisfaction. Thralls served, wiping the tables, pouring the mead, waiting until bellies were stretched and plates were bare. Their reward might be a bone with gristle still clinging, or broth thinned until the fat floated in translucent circles. It was abundance viewed through the thin crack of a door. Some thralls learned to steal moments. A piece of bread hidden beneath a tunic, a mouthful of milk stolen from the pail before it reached the mistress, a handful of berries foraged in the woods when no one watched. These small rebellions carried great risk. Discovery could mean a beating, or worse, a mark burned into the flesh as proof of theft. And yet, the hunger pressed so close that danger often seemed lighter than the emptiness of the stomach. The body betrayed its lack of nourishment. Thralls grew gaunt, their skin stretched thin, their teeth worn down by bread mixed with husks and grit. Children born into bondage grew smaller than those of the free, their bones bending under the weight of labour too early, their stomachs never full. The masters might remark on their weakness, never acknowledging that it was fashioned from deliberate deprivation. Even drink was rationed. Mead and ale, brewed from honey or barley, flowed freely for the free, but thralls received water that smelled faintly of wood or sour milk watered down. To taste sweetness on the tongue was a rarity, and when it came, perhaps a drop of mead spilled, perhaps a favour from a kinder hand, it seemed almost foreign, as though the mouth had forgotten what joy tasted like. Night fell, with hunger still gnawing. The day's portion never lasted to darkness. In the straw beds where thralls lay side by side, the stomach growled louder than the wind outside. Sleep was shallow, broken by the ache of emptiness. The masters dreamed of feasts, of ships filled with silver, of gods feasting in Valhalla. The enslaved dreamed of bread, soft, warm, plentiful, and woke with the taste of nothing on their lips. Food defined the rhythm of existence. Bread gave shape to labour, salt preserved the winter's hope, and the portion reminded each thrall of their station. It was not simply sustenance, it was the line between master and slave, the daily performance of power. To eat only what was given was to live each day under the reminder that your hunger belonged to another. The longhouse glowed in the dark, firelight flickering through its cracks, the smell of roasted meat lingering like a ghost. Inside, laughter carried late into the night, and in the shadows the thralls waited, their bellies hollow, their hands still calloused from grinding, serving, carrying. Bread, salt, and portion defined them, as surely as chains. And when the morning came, smoke curling again toward the beams, the same hunger would rise patient and sharp, demanding another day of obedience. The sea was as much a master as any chieftain. Its voice carried across the fjords, a low, endless rumble that reached even into the longhouse at night. When the ships were drawn down to the water, no thrall mistook the meaning. The oar was waiting, heavy as bone, worn smooth by the hands of others who had gripped it until their palms split open. A Viking ship was not simply wood and iron, it was labour made visible. The sleek hull that cut across the waves owed its grace to the countless backs bent over timber, the hours of hammering and caulking, the sweat of those who would never stand at the prow in triumph. For the thralls, the ship meant only toil. It was not freedom, but another form of confinement, moving not where they wished, but where they were commanded. When the signal came, bodies defiled into their places along the benches. The free men took the posts of honour, near the mast or under the shelter of the awning, where they could boast of journeys past. The thralls sat lower, their shoulders pressed against one another, feet braced against the ribs of the ship. The oar stretched before them, its shaft polished by decades of effort, its blade swallowing the water with each pull. To lift it was to feel the weight of both wood and expectation. The rhythm was not chosen by those who rowed. A drumbeat, steady and relentless, marked the pace. The overseer's eye never softened. Too slow, and a blow might follow. Too fast, and exhaustion would steal your strength before the day was done. The oar taught discipline more cruelly than any whip. Muscles burned, lungs heaved, blisters formed and burst. The sea cared little for comfort, and the masters cared even less. Salt spray stung the skin, seeping into every cut until pain became constant. The wind bit harder the farther the ship travelled from shore, and waves slammed against the hull with the force of fists, but no one paused. The row must continue, whether the fjord lay calm or the open ocean rose in anger. Each stroke chained you tighter to the ship, each pull binding you to the will of men who watched the horizon with hungry eyes. The voyages varied, sometimes a short passage along the coast, sometimes days or weeks across grey waters, where the sky itself seemed to close in. Food aboard was as meagre as on land: dried fish, hard bread, water that soured quickly in its cask. The masters claimed the better portions, leaving thralls to chew what was left, their stomachs turning at the taste of mould or brine. Hunger followed them onto the waves, just as it stalked them in the longhouse. At night, if rest was granted, bodies collapsed on the planks, pressed shoulder to shoulder, the oars set aside but never far. The stars overhead shone cold, unblinking. Free men spoke of them as guides, pointing out constellations, naming distant lands. Thralls closed their eyes against the same stars, knowing they were not markers of possibility, but reminders of distance. Distance from home, from freedom, from any life that might have been theirs. Storms turned the sea into a punishment no master could match. The oars became lifelines then, pulling desperately to keep the ship's prow into the waves. Water crashed over the sides, soaking clothes, numbing hands, filling lungs with salt. Masters shouted commands, their voices swallowed by the wind. Thralls bent low, pulling with whatever strength remained, not for glory, not for conquest, but simply to avoid being dragged under. Survival was demanded, yet no honour was given for achieving it. When raids came, the oar gave way to the sword, but not for those in bondage. The thralls remained at the benches, guarding the ship, tending to the animals, carrying the loot when the warriors returned with plunder. Gold, silver, silks, spoils taken from foreign shores, were piled high. None of it would pass into the thralls' hands, save as burdens to carry back onto the vessel. Victory songs rang out, loud and triumphant. For the rowers, the only rhythm was still the dip and rise of the oar. Injuries were common, shoulders torn from their sockets, hands rubbed raw, backs twisted from endless repetition. A thrall too broken to row became useless, a body discarded as easily as a cracked plank. Some were sold off, others simply abandoned. The ship demanded strength, and those who could not provide it found themselves forgotten, on some distant shore, left to die where no one would carve their names into stone. Yet the oar was more than wood and burden. It was also a cage without walls. While the ship skimmed across waters that seemed to promise endless horizons, the thrall knew that each pull only carried them farther from anything resembling freedom. Home faded into memory with every stroke. The rhythm of rowing erased the sound of old languages, old songs, old prayers. What remained was the creak of timbers, the splash of blades, the overseer's voice counting time. When land finally rose from the horizon, relief was short-lived. The oars had to be shipped, the vessel dragged onto shore, the cargo unloaded. Muscles that ached from rowing were driven to labour again. The ship did not release its hold when it touched earth. It merely changed the shape of its demands. Only when the masters feasted, only when they raised their horns in celebration, did the thralls taste the pause of stillness. But even then, the oars lay stacked nearby, waiting to be lifted again when command returned. The sea glistened, eternal and vast, yet it held no promise for those bound to it. The oar was their world, long and narrow, heavy and unforgiving. It pulled them through waters both calm and violent, yet it never carried them anywhere they wished to go. And as the sun sank over the fjords, painting the waves in fleeting gold, the thralls bent forward once more, hands blistered, backs bowed, bound to a rhythm that was not their own. The weight of the oar was not measured only in wood and water. It was the burden of servitude, the endless reminder that every horizon was a master's horizon, never theirs. And as the ship cut across the darkening sea, the sound of rowing blended with the wind, a ceaseless chorus of labour, carrying bodies farther into a life that belonged always to someone else. The clatter of chains was not always the sound of punishment. Sometimes it was business, ringing out across the damp air of a market square where human bodies stood in place of wares. The thrall was not only a labourer in a longhouse, not only a rower on a ship, but a commodity measured in weight, in scars, in the strength of arms. In Viking lands, markets for flesh stood beside those for fish, wool, and iron, as though one were no more remarkable than the other. The gathering place was crowded with stalls and carts, the smell of salt fish mixing with tar, sweat, and animal dung. Voices carried in many tongues, Norse, Danish, Frankish, Slavic, each cutting through the din with sharp syllables. But beneath the roar of trade, quieter sounds lingered. The whispers of those whose futures hung on the nod of a buyer, the shifting of bare feet against cold earth, the muffled cries of children held close by mothers who knew they could be torn apart. Buyers moved with appraising eyes, the way men looked at cattle. Fingers prodded arms, checked teeth, lifted hair to see if lice nested there. A merchant might boast of the strength of a man taken from the east, his broad shoulders ideal for the oar. Another would praise the endurance of a woman from Ireland, declaring her hands perfect for spinning wool or raising children in a new household. Age was counted, scars noted, obedience tested with sharp commands. The thrall stood silent, the judgment passing over them like a cold wind. Silver flowed across rough wooden tables, weighed and measured in small clipped pieces. A thrall's worth might be the cost of a cow, or less, depending on their health. A healthy man fetched more, a young woman even more still, for she could serve both in the field and in the bed. Children, if young enough, were cheap, malleable, unlikely to remember their homeland, easy to shape into the language and customs of their captors. Lives were tallied like livestock, each transaction another reminder that freedom had a price, and it was never theirs to pay. The market was not only for those freshly captured. A thrall who displeased his master, who grew too weak for the work demanded, might find himself sold off, passed from one household to another like a tool dulled by use. For some, this meant harsher hands. For others, merely a change of walls. The chains were constant, even if the voices shouting commands changed. A thrall learned quickly not to hope for mercy in the shift of ownership. But whispers travelled through such markets, carried from lip to ear in the shuffle of crowds. Rumours of raids yet to come, of ships preparing to sail west or east, of masters looking to buy not just labour, but concubines. These whispers were dangerous, yet they offered scraps of knowledge of lands across the sea, of kin who might have been taken elsewhere, of prices rising or falling depending on the season's harvest. Thralls had little power, but sometimes knowing was the closest thing to control. The humiliation of the market left marks deeper than iron. To stand unclothed in front of strangers, your body turned into something to be weighed and sold, stripped away the last pretense of personhood. Some looked down at the ground, refusing to meet a buyer's gaze. Others stared straight ahead, their eyes glassy, already retreating inward, as though the body on display belonged to someone else. A child might cling to a mother's skirt, only to be pulled away by rough hands when a higher bid demanded separation. The cries of loss cut through the crowd, yet no one paused. The market moved on, indifferent. For the free, such scenes were routine. A thrall was wealth, proof of status. A farmer might purchase one to tend fields. A housewife might insist on another to carry water. A chieftain might gather dozens to show his power. The market was not cruelty in their eyes, but necessity, part of the order of things. They spoke of it with the same tone they used to discuss the price of grain or the strength of timber. For the unfree, it was a reminder that they were not lives, but property. And yet, even in this, survival demanded adaptation. Thralls learned to listen carefully, to understand the wants of buyers, to nod when asked if they could spin wool, to flex an arm when told to show strength. Resistance was punished, but compliance might earn a slightly less brutal household. The line between dignity and survival blurred until both seemed like distant dreams. The market did not always end at sunset. Sometimes, bodies were loaded onto ships, the new owners eager to carry their purchase back across seas. The journey was just another extension of the sale, the thrall carried like cargo, bound at the wrists, listening to the creak of timbers and the laughter of those who had traded silver for their freedom. Other times, the newly bought walked through villages, heads bowed, led like animals by ropes. Eyes followed them, measuring, whispering, some with pity, others with envy. And always the whispers continued. The thrall markets connected lands as surely as the sea routes did. A man taken in the forests near Kiev might find himself beside a woman seized from an Irish village, both staring at the same buyer in a Danish port. The market braided together lives from distant places, binding them not with kinship, but with the same chain of servitude. It created a network of suffering, stretching farther than any single longhouse or farmstead, touching every shore the Vikings reached. When the market square emptied, silence did not follow. The echoes of shouts and bargains clung to the stones, as though the ground itself remembered the trades made upon it. For those who walked away in chains, the whispers did not end. They carried them into the longhouse, onto the ship, into the fields, into every corner of their existence. Whispers of the market reminded them that they had been measured, priced, and bought, and that the cycle could return at any moment. The thrall's life was never secure. The portion of bread, the weight of the oar, the shadow of the longhouse, all could be shifted with the clink of silver on a table. To be sold once was not to be safe from being sold again. And so the whispers of the market lingered, restless, reminding every unfree soul that their body was a possession, their future a transaction. their humanity reduced to the low murmur of buyers counting coins. The hearth at the centre of the longhouse burned steadily, casting an orange glow across the timbered hall. Shadows stretched over carved beams, over shields hung for display, over benches crowded with men and women of rank. The Lord's table stood at the far end, raised slightly above the others, broad enough to hold roasted meats, horn cups brimming with ale, and platters piled high with bread. Around it, voices swelled with laughter and argument, a chorus of wealth and authority echoing beneath the smoke-darkened rafters. To sit at such a table was privilege, not merely a matter of hunger. The order of seating revealed the web of power, who was closest to the chieftain, who was pushed to the edges. Every horn lifted, every bite taken was another reminder of status. And yet, in the glow of firelight and the weight of feast, the silence of those who served hung heavier than any voice. Thralls moved between the benches, their steps careful, their eyes owered. They carried trenchers of meat, pitchers of ale, baskets of bread. They knew the rhythm of a hall, when to approach, when to retreat, when to anticipate a raised hand or an empty cup. Their silence was not merely obedience, it was survival. A misstep could bring a cuff, a spilled drink might earn a lash. The feast was joy for some, fear for others. A lord might toss a bone to the dogs at his feet, but rarely to the thrall standing behind him. The best cuts were carved for warriors, for kin, for favoured guests. What remained, the gristle, the crusts, the scraps, was swept aside, left for the unfree to gather later, once the laughter had quieted and the smoke had thinned. Even then, the thrall did not eat at the table. They crouched in corners, in shadows, or outside in the cold, consuming what dignity had not already been stripped away. The silence of the thrall was not just during feasts. It stretched into every corner of the hall. They overheard secrets whispered between warriors, caught fragments of plans for raids or disputes over land. They knew the tone of a lord's anger, the sound of a guest's insult, the weight of decisions not meant for their ears. And yet they were voiceless, unable to repeat what they heard, unable to shape what they knew. Their silence became a vessel that held the hall's private truths, heavy and dangerous. The feasting itself was a spectacle of hierarchy. Ale flowed from great horns carved with beasts, passed from hand to hand in ritual order. Meat was carved with knives gleaming in the firelight, each slice given meaning by who received it. Songs rose, accompanied by the harp or the rasp of a fiddle. A skald might chant of Odin's wisdom, of Thor's strength, of victories won across the sea. The thralls listened, silent as ever, their bodies moving through the hall like shadows carrying burdens. For the unfree, the hall's splendour was a reminder of their distance from it. The benches were broad, the furs warm, the ale sweet, yet none of it belonged to them. They served the feast, but did not share it. Their silence was not chosen, but imposed, a constant reminder that their words, like their labour, were not their own. Sometimes a lord might notice a thrall, a hand might seize an arm, a voice might command service beyond the pouring of ale. A thrall could be pulled into the bed of a master, their body no more their own than the trenchers they carried. Such moments did not break silence, but deepened it. The thrall swallowed words they could not afford to say, endured what could not be resisted, and returned to duty as though nothing had occurred. Silence became not only the absence of speech, but the burial of pain. The table was also a stage of generosity, though rarely for the unfree. A lord might send food to a neighbour, boast of his wealth by sharing it among his guests, or pour ale until the benches rang with drunken cheer. Generosity confirmed status. It was a display of abundance. But the thrall was only part of the spectacle, the hands that made generosity possible without ever receiving it. Their silence was the unseen cost of abundance. As the night deepened, the hall grew louder, then softer. The songs gave way to murmurs, the horns emptied, the meat dwindled to bones, guests staggered to their furs, laughter dissolving into snores. The fire burned lower, casting long shadows that trembled on the walls. And still, the thralls remained, clearing trenches, gathering bones, carrying away the scraps. Their silence lingered even after the voices of the free had fallen quiet. The longhouse was both prison and shelter. The thrall found warmth there, a roof against the snow, the faint comfort of fire. But it was warmth that did not belong to them, fire that could turn cruel, shelter that held them captive. Their silence was the price of remaining within it, the only shield against the harsher cold beyond the walls. When morning came, the hall would wake again, the Lord's table would fill once more, the cycle of laughter and silence repeating itself. The thralls would move as they always did, unseen, unheard, carrying the weight of a feast that was never theirs. And in that endless cycle, the silence of the servant at the Lord's table became its own kind of voice, a voice that no one wished to hear, but that lingered, unspoken, in the smoke curling upward from the hearth. The Lord's table stood as a monument to power, to hierarchy, to the stark division between freedom and servitude. The silence that surrounded it was not emptiness, but a presence, a constant reminder that beneath the noise of laughter and song, there were those who endured unseen, unheard, and unacknowledged. It was a silence that did not break, because breaking it would mean a punishment harsher than hunger, harsher even than chains. And so the feast ended as it always did, not with applause or with song, but with silence, carried on the shoulders of those who served. The fire in the longhouse was never enough when the wind turned cruel. Outside, snow pressed against the timber walls, each gust rattling the roof as if the sky itself sought entry. Winter in the north was not a season, but a sentence, a long punishment measured in dwindling food stores and the sharp ache of frozen air. For the free, it was a challenge. For the unfree, it was a threat to survival. Grain bins were checked and rechecked. The salted fish, stacked in barrels, were counted with unease. Meat hung from rafters, darkened by smoke, rationed more carefully with each passing week. A chieftain might feast still, though with less splendour than in summer, but the hall's abundance narrowed into hierarchy once more. The best cuts went to the lord, then to his family, then to favoured warriors. What remained trickled downward until at last it reached the thralls. The weakest hands, the ones least useful in labour, found themselves left with almost nothing. Hunger made the hall restless. Warriors grew irritable, snapping at small offences. Children cried more often, their bellies empty. The thralls, though, had no voice for complaint. Their hunger was silent, endured in shadows, born in the hollowness of their bodies. Bread crusts hardened to stone were soaked in water and swallowed. Thin broths, more water than sustenance, warmed without filling. A thrall might chew on the marrow of discarded bones, scraping out what little life remained in them. The body weakened slowly, and in the silence of servitude, weakness was as dangerous as defiance. When food grew scarce, labour did not lessen. Fields had to be cleared of snow, animals tended in their pens, wood split and carried. The work was harsh, the cold biting through thin wool and worn leather. A thrall's hands cracked and bled, raw from the axe and the rope. Still they worked, for to falter was to invite punishment, or worse, to be deemed useless. In the logic of the longhouse, everybody had to earn its portion. A strong back at the oar, a steady hand at the loom, a quick step with the water bucket. These things ensured survival. But when the body failed, when illness or hunger left a thrall unable to rise from the straw, the hall had little patience. A master might see them as a burden, one more mouth in a season when mouths could not all be fed. The weakest hands, trembling in the cold, became the first at risk of being abandoned to it. Winter was a test not only of endurance, but of worth. A thrall who endured the hunger, who continued to labour despite the gnawing emptiness, might survive to see spring. But for everyone who endured, another faltered, and faltering often meant vanishing. Some slipped away in the night, hoping to find scraps in the forest, or mercy in another hall, though few found either. Others simply withered, their bodies giving out quietly, their silence unbroken to the end. Their absence left no great mark, for the hall moved on, its concern fixed on those who remained strong. The cruelty of winter was not always deliberate. Even masters feared the season, for it threatened all alike. Yet the weight of scarcity fell hardest on those with no claim to protection. A family might stretch its food to save a child, a warrior, a wife. A thrall had no such claim. Their survival was tethered to usefulness, and hunger stripped usefulness away. The hall itself bore witness to these trials. The fire dimmed earlier, when wood ran low, leaving the corners colder and darker. The smoke from damp logs stung the eyes, making even breath a discomfort. The thralls lay close together at night, pressed for warmth, their dreams filled with the taste of food that would not come. Sleep did not soften hunger, it sharpened it, reminding them with every stir of the belly that the winter was long and merciless. There were stories whispered in such nights, not of gods or heroes, but of those who had not survived winters past. Names of thralls who had collapsed while carrying water, of children lost to sickness when the cold cut too deep. Their memories were carried not by song, but by murmurs, half-remembered voices drifting among the straw. The hall forgot them quickly, but the thralls remembered, for the stories were warnings of what awaited the weakest hands. Spring was always promised, but in the depths of winter, that promise seemed thin. The snow lay heavy on the fields, the rivers froze solid, the sea locked its ships in ice. Days shortened, the sun barely rising before sinking again, its light cold and pale. Each morning, hunger returned as though it had never left, and each night it waited patiently for the dawn. Survival was not triumph, but endurance. A quiet persistence that left no glory, no song, only breath in the cold. And yet, there was no rebellion. Hunger did not lead to uprising, but to deeper silence. The thralls bent their backs, carried wood, tended animals, hauled water. Each act was a small plea for survival, a way of saying without words, "See, I am still useful, still worth feeding." The Lord's table shrank in abundance, but the thrall's silence grew louder, the unspoken truth of lives held just above the brink of starvation. Winter was not the enemy alone. It was the hand that pressed hardest on those already bound. For the free, it was hardship. For the unfree, it was judgment, sifting the strong from the weak, deciding who would carry chains into another year, and who would vanish beneath the snow. The weakest hands did not only falter in labour, they disappeared into silence, their absence noted only in the smaller pile of straw at night, the lighter burden of rations in the morning. When the winds howled against the longhouse, when the fire dimmed, when hunger settled like a weight in the belly, it was not only the cold that tested survival. It was the knowledge that, in this order of life, some were not meant to endure. Winter revealed that truth more plainly than any summer raid or autumn feast. It showed that for the thrall, survival was not promised. It was borrowed, fragile, and often denied to the weakest among them. The long nights of winter demanded more than silence and labour. They demanded distraction. When hunger pressed, when the cold gnawed through walls and furs, when the sea lay frozen and the fields dead beneath snow, the free found solace in gathering. Smoke drifted thick from the hearth. Mead sloshed into horns, and voices rose in song. The hall became both refuge and stage, its walls resonating with laughter, quarrel, and tales of glory. The smoke curled above the beams, clinging to rafters already blackened by years of fire. It blurred the air, making eyes sting and throats rasp, but no one minded. Smoke was a reminder that the hearth still burned, that warmth and light held against the dark. For the free, it was comfort. For those who served, it was suffocation endured in silence, their hands moving through haze to pour and carry, while their lungs choked on air too thick to breathe. Mead sweetened the bitterness of winter. Honeyed, golden, warmed in horn or cup, it blurred sharp edges, softened tempers, coaxed songs from weary throats. To drink deeply was a mark of status. To refuse was unthinkable. The horns were passed with ritual order, beginning with the Lord and moving outward, each sip a reaffirmation of bonds between men, between kin, between allies. Mead did more than quench thirst. It bound the hall in drunken unity. But the thralls did not drink. They filled the horns, refilled them, carried more from clay jars to waiting hands. The taste of mead, if it touched their tongues at all, was the dregs left behind, a smear of sweetness clinging to the rim of a vessel before it was scrubbed clean. They served intoxication without sharing in it, their own sobriety another form of enforced silence. The songs of masters carried far into the night. Skalds, keepers of memory, recited verses that wound through time, praising ancestors, boasting of battles, warning of treachery. A hall could become a tapestry of sound, each note woven with pride and myth. Stories of gods were sung: Odin, wise but ruthless; Thor, strong and reckless; Freyja, fierce and desired. These songs reminded the free of their place in the world, their destiny tied to the fates of warriors and kings. The thralls listened. They had no choice but to hear the verses repeated, year after year, until they could mouth them silently as they poured drink and carried trenchers. The songs were not theirs, but they lived in their memory. A thrall could recall the deeds of heroes more vividly than their own forgotten village, could recite lines of poetry while unable to remember the sound of their mother's voice. In this way, the songs of masters seeped into their silence, reshaping even their dreams. The songs were not always noble. Mead loosened tongues, and warriors sang of raids with laughter, mocking the terror of those they had slain or enslaved. They mimicked the cries of captured women, boasted of fires set in foreign villages, gloried in the silver and thralls taken. The hall roared with approval at such verses, the sound of joy for some, and despair for others. For a thrall who had lived such moments from the other side, the song was a wound torn open again, disguised as entertainment. Yet the hall demanded cheer. A thrall could not grimace, could not let sorrow or anger show. Their silence had to be complete, even when songs mocked their own suffering. The weight of such silence was heavier than chains, pressing on the chest, forcing the body to bend beneath the strain. Not all songs were brutal. Some praised the harvest, the turning of seasons, the bond of kin. Some mourned the dead, voices dipping low into laments that shook even the hardest warriors. But even these softer moments were not shared equally. A thrall's dead were not remembered in verse. Their grief remained private, swallowed down like scraps of bread, unseen by those who filled the hall with their own sorrow. The noise of the hall grew with each cup of mead. Laughter broke into quarrels, quarrels into brawls, fists striking tables, knives flashing when tempers flared too far. A lord's voice might thunder to restore order, or sometimes he let the chaos run its course, the violence itself a release for men trapped in winter's grip. Thralls moved carefully through such storms, stepping lightly to avoid blows, keeping their heads low lest drunken rage fall upon them. When the night at last weakened, when the horns lay empty and voices turned hoarse, the songs faded. Warriors collapsed onto benches, their snores as loud as their laughter had been. Smoke still clung to the air, the hearth dimming to embers. Thralls remained awake, gathering horns, scrubbing wooden trenchers, scraping grease into pots, wiping spilled mead from the tables. Their work extended beyond the joy of the free, their silence carrying long after the songs had ended. For the unfree, the hall's merriment was a kind of torment, an endless reminder that they lived not in their own story, but in the stories sung by others. They existed within the songs of masters, as shadows, as trophies, as nameless figures taken in raids. The silence of the thrall never entered verse, never echoed from the rafters, never outlasted the smoke. And yet the songs endured. They stitched themselves into memory, haunting even those who despised them. In the silence of the straw bed at night, thralls heard again the scold's voice, the laughter of warriors, the rhythm of words that turned suffering into glory. The songs of masters became the lullabies of the unfree, whether they wished it or not. The hall slept, the smoke drifted upward, the embers glowed faintly. Silence returned, but it was not empty silence. It was heavy, filled with the weight of songs that would be sung again tomorrow, and the next night, and the next, until winter finally loosened its grip. The masters had their songs, their mead, their smoke-filled laughter. The thralls had their silence, and between the two, the longhouse endured, a place where joy and sorrow lived side by side but never touched. The air inside the longhouse was thick with heat, smoke, and a silence that was not truly silent. Every breath carried the mingled odours of pine resin, singed hair, and mead spilled on the packed earth floor. In the dim light, the smoke curled upward, snaking around the rafters where dried fish and strips of meat hung, waiting to be consumed in the endless cold. Shadows trembled against the carved beams as flames from the central hearth flickered and hissed. The gathering was not a feast in the ordinary sense. No laughter ran freely, and no voice dared rise without weight. This was not a night for lightness. It was a night for watching, for waiting, for the unspoken understanding that blood would be drawn before the embers cooled. For those bound in servitude, the thralls pressed close to the walls. The tension of the gathering was heavier than any yoke or chain. Their lives, already measured in toil, could be redirected in a moment by a gesture from their master, or by the inscrutable logic of the gods. To be alive in such a place was not to live freely, but to endure the rhythm of another's will. And on nights like this, when ceremony and sacrifice walked hand in hand, that rhythm sharpened into a blade. The chieftain sat near the high seat, his fur cloak spread around his shoulders like the pelt of some great beast. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed not on the fire, but on the figure standing before it. The priest, his beard long and untrimmed, his face marked with ash, moved slowly around the hearth. His steps were deliberate, almost as though the earth itself had to be persuaded to allow his weight. In his hand, bound in cloth, something glinted faintly whenever the firelight struck it. The thralls avoided looking at him directly, their eyes darting instead to the clay bowls of blood-red mead set along the benches, to the carved runes etched into the wooden pillars, to the way the priest's lips murmured words in an ancient tongue that carried the gravity of storms. They did not need to hear every syllable to know what was being said. The ceremony was not foreign to them. They had seen the signs carved, the songs sung, the way silence turned into a weapon sharper than steel. The knife that mattered was not only the one in the priest's hand, but the one lodged in the heart of uncertainty, always waiting to twist. Sacrifice, in this world, was not metaphor. It was not memory. It was present. A life, chosen, to secure the favour of gods who demanded repayment in blood for every harvest gathered, every voyage returned safely, every winter endured. To modern ears, it might sound unthinkable, but to them, it was as essential as bread or fire. To withhold was to invite ruin. To offer was to balance a scale that could never be left unattended. The thralls knew their place in such balances. A man of standing might sacrifice a horse, a prized animal whose spirit could be sent to carry his prayers into the unseen. But sometimes a life of lesser weight was deemed fit, one already bent under the yoke of ownership, whose disappearance could be explained with little consequence. A slave did not belong to themselves. They belonged to the whims of need, to the demand of the hour. If the gods whispered for blood, the hand of the master determined whose veins would answer. This knowledge settled like iron in the bones. A thrall who served bread and salt at the Lord's table might be alive in the morning, but by nightfall they could be bound at the wrists, led beneath the open sky, and laid upon the stone. The line between serving and being sacrificed was drawn thin, shifting with the seasons, with famine, with fear, with the inscrutable moods of both gods and men. The ceremony grew heavier as the priest began to chant louder. His voice rolled through the longhouse, rising and falling with a rhythm older than the walls themselves. Some of the freeborn raised their cups in unison, drinking deeply, their faces gleaming in the firelight. Others sat rigid, eyes glistening as they stared into the flames, as though already conversing with the unseen. Among the thralls, there was no drinking, no gesture of participation. They simply watched, hands clenched in their laps, feet pressing against the earth as if bracing for something unseen. The knife was revealed at last. Its blade, polished and gleaming, seemed to drink the fire's glow. The priest lifted it with both hands, murmuring the names of gods whose domains spanned storm, fertility, and death. A horse was led forward, muscles quivering, eyes wide, nostrils flaring with the smell of fire and men. It stamped the earth, trying to resist, but the rope around its neck pulled it into place. The knife flashed once, then sank deep. A shudder ran through the animal's body as its life drained onto the waiting soil. The crowd let out a sound, not quite a cheer, not quite a sigh, but something in between. Relief, gratitude, fear dressed as reverence. The blood spilled was gathered in bowls, smeared across the carved posts, sprinkled on the foreheads of those seated near the fire. The horse had been chosen, and so, for this night, the thralls breathed a fraction easier. But the ease was fragile. The knife did not care whose flesh it tasted. Tonight it had cut the throat of a beast. Tomorrow it could just as easily rest on the skin of a man or woman who had no shield, no kin, no name beyond what their master had given. The ceremony reminded every soul in the hall, both free and bound, that life was conditional. That to survive was not to escape, but to wait, knowing that waiting was the only control left. For those who belonged to themselves, The sacrifice was spectacle and reassurance. For those who belonged to others, it was a mirror of their own fragility. The knife, hidden in ceremony, was never just about the gods. It was about power, and how easily it could shift its edge. And so, as the smoke rose and the songs of gratitude began, the thralls lowered their eyes, their bodies pressed into stillness, aware that every chant was also a warning. The ceremony would end, but the knife would not vanish. It would simply wait in silence, gleaming in memory, ready to be lifted again when the balance demanded it. The fire outside had long since dimmed, leaving only embers that pulsed like the last heartbeat of a dying beast. Beyond the longhouse, the night was not silent, but murmuring. Wind through pine needles, the low bark of a dog straining at its tether, the muted creak of a roof beam cooling under frost. In the courtyard, a single figure stood at the centre, lit faintly by a torch planted in the frozen soil. The torchlight revealed not a throne or a feast, but a tall carved pole, rising like the trunk of a tree that had learned to speak. This was no simple decoration. It was the god pole, the sacred marker through which the unseen pressed its weight into the world of men. Its wood was old, blackened by smoke and years of ritual. Runes carved deep into its length seemed to shimmer when the flames licked across them, the lines alive with shapes that could never be mistaken for mere ornament. Faces had been cut into its surface, grim, stylized, some with mouths open as if in mid-chant, others staring with hollow eyes that seemed to watch even when the fire dimmed. At its base lay offerings, bones, scraps of cloth, a few coins dulled by the weather, and darker stains that the earth had long since absorbed. The thralls had no right to approach it unless commanded, but they felt its presence with each glance, each whispered word carried in its shadow. The god pole was as much a threat as a symbol of protection, for to stand in its gaze was to be reminded that nothing, neither man nor slave, lord nor warrior, was beyond the grasp of divine expectation. For the freeborn, that expectation was wrapped in duty and honour. For the enslaved, it was a shadow that lengthened every day, heavy with the knowledge that their lives might end at its base with a single gesture from their master. The stories spoken of the pole travelled in low voices, half prayers, half warnings. It was said that the gods themselves listened through its wood, that the smoke of burnt offerings seeped upward into the realms unseen. Some whispered that the pole's face would change in subtle ways from season to season, its carved features shifting like something alive. Others said it had no fixed face at all, only the reflection of whoever stood before it, an unyielding mirror of human fear and desire. Whatever the truth, no one doubted its power. To doubt was to invite danger, not only from the gods, but from the men who served them with knife and fire. The thralls learned quickly what it meant to labour under that watchful presence. They carried stones to repair the mound near the pole, dragged timber to fuel the fires that were lit at its base during certain nights, and swept away the remnants of past offerings without comment. Their hands became as much a part of the rituals as the chants of the priest, yet their voices were never heard. They existed in silence, their own prayers swallowed before they could form. A thrall who gazed too long at the carved faces could find themselves accused of presumption, as though their eyes had trespassed into spaces forbidden. What the pole demanded, none could fully know. Sometimes it drank blood, sometimes it seemed satisfied with mead and bread. But the uncertainty was its own form of torment, for even the smallest ritual carried the chance that more would be required. To stand near it was to feel the knife in ceremony, even when no blade was drawn. During the darkest winters, when food thinned and bellies hollowed, the god pole loomed heavier in the mind. Desperation sharpened ritual, and the line between devotion and sacrifice narrowed dangerously. A thrall might notice the way their master's gaze lingered on them a moment longer than usual, measuring something beyond muscle or skill. A boy too young to plough, a woman worn from toil, a man who stumbled too often under the weight of the oar, all could be made into an offering if the god seemed restless. The pole was no passive witness. It was the stage where the unspoken choices of survival were made visible. Even in moments of seeming stillness, it drew shadows around it. The priest claimed to hear voices through the wood, mutterings in a tongue older than men, answers to questions spoken only in his heart. No one else could confirm it, but none dared question. When the priest lifted his hand to the pole and returned with words of command, the longhouse obeyed. Whether the voices were real or imagined mattered less than the fact that lives shifted according to them. For the thralls, the pole was both near and unreachable. They might kneel beside it to scrub the stone, their fingers brushing against runes they could not read. They might feel the roughness of its base beneath their hands as they cleared away offerings left to rot. They might even smell the resin and smoke clinging to its grain, sharp and bitter in the nose. But it was never theirs. It belonged to the gods, to the masters who called upon them, and to the endless cycle of fear and reverence that bound the community together. And yet, some whispered in private that the pole's shadows held other truths, that when no one watched, when the night was deepest, one could hear not the gods, but the murmurs of all those who had been bound and broken in its presence, that the earth beneath it was not only rich with offerings, but thick with memory, voices layered upon voices, carried not upward but downward into soil that remembered. Whether such whispers brought comfort or dread depended on the listener. To some thralls, it was proof they were not forgotten. To others, it was a reminder that survival left only echoes, not freedom. The god pole stood unmoving, but its shadows moved across every life within sight of it. Shadows that stretched into the longhouse, into the market, into the very rhythm of work and rest. No chain was needed when belief itself could bind so tightly. To live beneath it was to understand that even silence was not safe, that even the absence of ritual carried risk. The gods, it was said, saw everything, and if they saw through the pole, then there was no hiding, not in the corner of the longhouse, not behind the barn, not even in the folds of one's own thoughts. The torch guttered in the wind, but the pole did not fade. It remained, tall and watchful, etched with marks that blurred in the dark, until they seemed like veins, like cracks, like scars. Its presence was a weight that never lifted, a reminder that in this world, power wore many faces. The lash of a master, the hunger of winter, the edge of a knife, and the shadows behind the god pole that reached farther than any chain. The air was thick with resin and wood smoke, the kind that clung to skin long after the fire had burned down. Pine branches, cut fresh, were laid along the path toward the sacred ground, their scent sharp beneath the frost. Torches lined the way, not for warmth but for visibility, marking the space as set apart. This was not an ordinary gathering. The word blot carried its own gravity, a ritual heavy with promises and demands. It meant offering. An offering was never light. The freeborn gathered first, cloaks wrapped tightly around their shoulders, their eyes steady but alert, as if waiting for the gods themselves to arrive. The priest moved among them, muttering chants, his voice sometimes swallowed by the wind, sometimes rising loud enough to carry across the crowd. The masters stood at the front, closest to the carved images raised high, while the rest of the household lingered behind. At the edges, pressed into silence, stood the thralls. Chains rattled faintly, not in protest, but in motion. The sound was quiet at first, almost lost beneath the shuffle of boots, but it was unmistakable. Iron links looped around wrists and ankles, carried not as punishment, but as preparation. The blot was not only about feasting or prayer, it was about proving loyalty to the unseen, about showing that the living world could give back what it had been lent. Animals were led forward too, cattle with wide dark eyes, goats pulled along by cords, a horse stamping nervously at the smell of fire. Yet for all their weight, it was the human figures in chains that drew the stillness. No one spoke of them aloud, but everyone's gaze slid toward them. They were chosen not for their crimes, for a thrall's life allowed no such accounting, but for their usefulness to the gods. Sometimes the decision came from a priest's whisper after a night of signs, sometimes from a master eager to secure a harvest or victory at sea. To be bound for the blot was not a sentence to be negotiated. It was the end of one life and the transformation into another, a passage from silence to sacrifice. The procession moved slowly, deliberate with each step. Thralls not chosen for chains carried the tools of ritual, wooden bowls, knives wrapped in cloth, buckets filled with water drawn that morning from the river. Their tasks gave them no distance from what was unfolding. If anything, it bound them closer. Each breath reminded them of the possibility that the next gathering could place iron at their own wrists. The gods required blood, and blood did not always mean animal. The pole loomed at the centre of the sacred ground. Its runes deepened with each passing season. Around it, a circle of stones marked the boundary where ordinary life fell away. Inside that circle the rules changed. Voices lowered, movements slowed, and the sense of time itself grew uncertain. The chained figures were led across the stones, their faces hidden in shadow. No cry escaped them, not because fear was absent, but because fear had already hollowed them. They had lived long enough under the shadow of the god pole to know what silence meant. The priest raised his staff, carved from ash, its top bound with strips of hide. His words carried over the assembly, a chant thick with old syllables few understood completely, but all recognized. The rhythm was as familiar as breath, a pulse that guided every motion. When he called for the offering, the chosen were pushed forward. Their chains clinked against the stones, louder now in the circle's stillness, each step a declaration that flesh had been given to seal the bond between human and divine. What happened within the circle was not hidden. It was seen by all, not as spectacle, but as necessity. Blood fell into the bowls, warm against the cold night, and from there it was sprinkled across stones, poles, and faces. It marked the living as much as it fed the unseen. To stand in its spray was to be reminded that one lived because another did not. The masters lifted their heads proudly as the priests smeared it across their brows, while the thralls lowered their eyes, each drop a reminder of chains they still wore, visible or not. The feast that followed was not simply about abundance, meat roasted over fire, bread passed hand to hand, horns of mead lifted high. It was a celebration threaded with survival. The gods had been fed, the community had been bound together, and the price had been paid. Yet beneath the sound of laughter and song, the silence of those who had walked in chains lingered. Their absence was a presence, heavy as smoke. No thrall could forget the sight. Even if they looked away, the memory etched itself into the mind like a rune carved into wood. Each ritual reinforced the truth that their bodies were not their own, that any dawn might bring the order to walk with iron clinking against stone. the masters called it devotion. For those who laboured in silence, it was a reminder that their lives were fragile offerings waiting to be claimed. The blot ended when the fires dimmed and the last of the mead was poured out upon the ground. The priest lowered his staff and the crowd slowly dispersed. Cloaks drawn tight, voices hushed, they walked away knowing that the gods had been honoured, but also that hunger and fear would return soon enough. Only the pole remained, watching in silence, its carved eyes glinting faintly in the fading light. And in the minds of the thralls, the clink of chains never ceased. It followed them back to the longhouse, into their straw beds, into their dreams. For the blot was not only an offering, it was a reminder that survival under Viking skies was always conditional, always weighted, and always tied to the willingness of gods and men to demand blood. The night had broken into morning, but no warmth came with it. The sun, low and pale, dragged across the horizon as though reluctant to rise. Frost clung to every surface, brittle on the grass, sharp on the stones. Beneath the god pole, the earth bore fresh stains, still dark against the white crust of snow. Blood, once steaming in the cold air, had frozen into black rivulets, seeping into soil already heavy with years of sacrifice. The ground itself seemed to carry memory. Each winter pressed the stains deeper. Each thaw released them back into sight. The earth did not forget, nor did those who walked across it. The crunch of boots on frost was joined by the crack of frozen drops breaking underfoot, a reminder that the god's portion had already been claimed. For those who passed through the sacred ground at dawn, masters with heads high, thralls with eyes lowered, there was no mistaking the message carved into soil. Life ended here, and life endured here, bound together by the same cold bargain. Animals came to sniff at the edges, drawn by the salt in the frozen patches, but even they hesitated. Dogs whined low in their throats before turning away. Horses shied at the smell, hooves stamping nervously. The blood of beasts and men alike lingered longer than any offering of bread or mead, for it marked the place as touched, as changed. To live near it was to be reminded each day that the gods were never far, and that the distance between worshipper and offering was thinner than the skin stretched over bone. The thralls returned to their duties quickly, though their steps slowed when they crossed the ground. They carried buckets of water to wash stones slick with iron-red ice, their fingers raw from the cold. They shovelled snow to cover the darkest patches, though the colour always seeped back through, stubborn as the memory of cries. Each task was performed with bowed head, not because anyone ordered it, but because to lift one's gaze toward the pole or the stains too long was to invite thoughts best left unspoken. The masters treated the blood differently. Some stepped carefully to avoid it, while others walked deliberately across, their boots marking trails that smudged the frozen patches. To them, the sight was not warning, but proof. The gods had received, the community had given, the balance was kept. They looked upon the blood as assurance that their households would endure the hunger of winter, that their ships would find favour at sea, that their enemies would falter when battle came. Yet even in their certainty, the silence of the ground carried weight. The gods were satisfied for now, but no one believed the offering had ended. It was only ever postponed. When wind swept across the field, it carried with it a metallic tang, sharp against the tongue. The thralls could taste it even as they chewed their coarse bread, their hands stiff from labour. Each bite carried the memory of what had been spilled, as though survival itself was flavoured with iron. No song was sung at such meals, only the crackle of fire and the scrape of wooden spoons in bowls. Hunger forced the food down, but the silence reminded all that it had been bought at a cost. The children of the freeborn asked questions sometimes, voices untempered by caution. They pointed to the stains and asked whose they were, or why the ground always seemed darker near the pole. Their mothers hushed them quickly, not with answers but with warnings. Questions themselves carried danger, for curiosity could be mistaken for doubt, and doubt was a shadow the gods did not tolerate. The thralls listened to these exchanges quietly, knowing no one would ever answer their own unspoken questions. Their silence was both shield and prison, for to speak even once could be to join the blood beneath the snow. The memory of sacrifice stretched beyond the sacred ground. In the longhouse, when the fire burned low and voices dropped into murmurs, the thralls heard the masters recall past winters, past offerings, the times when blood had ensured survival. The names of animals were spoken, sometimes the names of men, though these were said with less detail. To mention a thrall by name after death was to risk giving them too much weight, too much presence. Better to let them sink into the frozen earth, nameless as the stains they left behind. But memory had a way of clinging. The thralls remembered, even if they did not speak. They remembered the faces of those who had walked in chains, the way their breath had steamed in the cold, the way the frost had hardened beneath them. They remembered the smell of smoke thickened by blood, the sound of chanting rising as cries fell silent. Memory could not be shovelled away with snow. It lived in the body, in the twitch of muscles when a knife scraped too close to skin, in the tightening of the chest when footsteps echoed on frozen ground. The earth, too, seemed to breathe with it. Come spring, when the frost melted and water ran across the stones, streaks of red-brown spread into rivulets, carrying the past into the streams. Fields were planted in soil that had drunk deeply of what had been offered. Bread rose from ovens carrying the same unseen trace. Even in the act of survival, the bond to sacrifice was renewed. To eat was to consume more than grain. To drink was to swallow more than water. Survival was never clean. It was stained in ways the eye could not always see, but the heart could never forget. The frozen earth, marked and silent, stood as a testament more enduring than words. Each winter carved another layer into its memory. Each offering pressed deeper into its soil. To live near it was to walk daily over the truth that human life was fragile, that its measure lay not in choice, but in the needs of others, masters, gods, hunger, and fate. The stains did not fade. They waited, patient as frost, for the next drop, the next life, the next reminder that survival in the Viking world was always balanced on the thin crust of frozen blood. Inside the longhouse, warmth pressed thick against the walls, heavy with the smoke of burning pine and the steam rising from cauldrons. Fat hissed where it dripped onto fire, and the smell of roasting meat clung to every breath. Outside, frost gnawed at the fields, but within, the benches filled with the freeborn, their cloaks drawn close, their cups brimming. The feast was not merely food, it was declaration. In the heart of winter, when the land yielded nothing but silence, men and women gathered to prove they could still summon plenty. The tables creaked under their weight, bowls of porridge thick with butter, trenchers piled high with bread darkened from rye, joints of meat carried sizzling from the hearth. The sound of knives against wooden plates was joined by laughter, by voices raised in boasts and songs. Horns of ale passed from hand to hand, spilling golden foam across the boards. Each mouthful seemed to defy the season outside, as though hunger itself could be drowned beneath layers of fat and drink. But not all eyes in the hall shared the joy. The thralls moved silently between benches, carrying platters and scraping bones into buckets. They ate later, in corners, with what was left. Their hands brushed the same boards that held the master's feasts, yet their share never reached beyond scraps. And still, even in their hunger, they dared not glance too long at the high seats. For the shadows of the dead seemed to lean against those places, silent but present, reminding all who watched that abundance had not come freely. The feast was built on the blood that had seeped into frozen soil only days before. Those sacrificed were not spoken of aloud, but their absence filled the hall as much as the smoke. Each laugh, each clatter of cups, carried an echo behind it, the echo of cries that had been silenced for the gods. The freeborn ate as if they believed the feast was a gift. Yet in truth, it was payment. Every bite, every gulp of ale, was taken with the knowledge that someone else's life had been laid down to make it possible. The fires glow threw shadows against the carved beams overhead. In their shifting shapes, some claim to see faces. A hollow of flame against wood might suggest the curve of a cheek, a ripple in smoke, the tilt of a head. The children whispered of it when they thought no one heard, pointing to the beams as if the dead had climbed into the rafters to watch. Their elders hushed them quickly, but even grown men lowered their eyes when the fire spat and shapes seemed to stir. For in the Viking world, death was not absence. It was presence, nearer than breath, nearer than the frost on the other side of the wall. As songs rose, praising gods and ancestors, the rhythm of drums joined in, low and steady, like the heartbeat of the hall itself. The voices carried tales of heroes who had crossed seas, of battles won with iron and fire, of ships that had glided home laden with silver. Yet between the verses, silence sometimes fell too heavily. A sudden pause in song, a flicker of flame that darkened a corner, and all could feel the weight of eyes unseen. The feast celebrated the living, but the dead pressed close, demanding their share of remembrance. The thralls, who kept their hands busy and their mouths shut, knew better than to think the dead could be ignored. They felt them most keenly, for they carried the platters past the benches where shadows deepened. They knew the stories whispered in low voices, that to fail in serving properly, to spill ale, to falter in duty, was to invite the wrath not only of the living masters, but of the restless ones who lingered unseen. The dead were not patient. They did not forgive mistakes. Every task completed in silence was an act of survival, not only in the world of flesh, but in the world beyond it. When the cauldrons emptied, and bones piled high in buckets, the hall filled with the smell of smoke, sweat, and ale-soaked breath. The masters leaned back, their bellies swollen, their cheeks flushed red. Songs grew louder, more slurred, their rhythm breaking into shouts and laughter. Women clapped in time, men struck the tables with fists, the noise rising until the beam shook. Yet even then, the shadows remained unmoved, steady as the frost outside. For the feast had not banished them, it had only drawn them closer. Every full belly was a reminder that hunger had been pushed away by blood. Every song sung to the gods was a reminder that the gods themselves had listened, only after being fed. The living feasted, but the dead waited. They always waited. Toward the far end of the hall, a high seat stood empty, draped in furs. No one claimed it, though none said why. The place was left for the unseen, for those whose names no longer passed living lips. The thralls dared not look at it, and the masters looked too often, as if searching for approval. In that silence, one truth lay heavy. The feast was not only for the living. It was a meal shared with those who had given their breath to ensure it could take place at all. And so the longhouse stood, filled with noise and silence in equal measure. The fire burned high. The benches groaned under weight. The air thickened with smoke and steam. Yet beneath it all, the frozen earth outside seemed to pulse through the floor, carrying memory upward. The feast might end, the songs might falter, the cups might empty, but the stains on the ground endured. They watched, as much as any eyes in the rafters, as much as any face glimpsed in smoke. For in the Viking world, the dead were never far. They gathered at the edges of firelight, silent guests at every feast. The living raised horns and laughed, but the dead listened, patient, as if waiting for the next seat to be filled. The warmth of feasting fires always faded too quickly. By morning, smoke clung to hair and clothes, and bellies ached from too much drink or too little food, depending on where one sat. The hall emptied, leaving only ash in the hearth and bones scattered in buckets for the dogs. But while the songs echoed in memory, another rhythm took hold outside, one colder and older, the rhythm of trade. The Viking world was bound together, not only by oars and axes, but by bargains struck in words and sealed with flesh. Markets rose on the edges of rivers and in the shadows of palisades, places where chests of silver were opened, scales laid out, and lives weighed like livestock. The thrall was currency as much as coin. For the chieftain who wanted to build power, for the farmer who sought more hands to till frozen fields, for the trader whose ship hugged the coastlines in search of wealth. Human beings were units of exchange. Men captured in raids, women torn from villages, children lifted screaming into ships. They all arrived in such markets as silence bound property. The clink of silver might decide whether one life was carried north into harsher winters or south to the unknown. Sometimes the bargaining was not even with strangers, but within the same household. A master, burdened by debt or seeking alliance, might trade away his own thrall, a man or woman who had served under his roof for years. To him it was transaction. To them, it was erasure. The market itself held a strange stillness. Voices haggled, hands gestured, scales tipped back and forth. But beneath it all, the eyes of the enslaved made a silence too heavy to ignore. They stood roped or chained, waiting for a verdict, spoken not by gods but by merchants. The smell of hides, fish and smoke mixed with the fear that clung to the air, thick as frost. Each bargain carved a life into pieces. Price, strength, obedience. Humanity was broken down into qualities listed like the features of a horse. And yet, fear was not confined to those being sold. The buyers too carried unease, though they cloaked it in authority. To purchase a thrall was to purchase risk, an enemy who remembered what was taken, a witness who carried every insult in silence. Masters feared rebellion as much as thralls feared the whip. The balance of fear was the chain that bound them together, each link forged in the knowledge that both sides lived under constant threats, though one far heavier than the other. The bargaining did not end with the market. Every day afterward was a negotiation, unspoken but felt. A thrall who hesitated too long at a command might test the patience of a master, already haunted by the thought of betrayal. A master who demanded too much, who lashed too freely, might find his household poisoned not by open defiance, but by quiet refusals, by work left undone when eyes turned away. The bargain of fear had no end, only renewal, again and again, with each command given and each silence obeyed. Beyond the villages, on distant shores, human flesh became part of larger bargains still. Across the Baltic, across rivers that cut through forests, slaves were exchanged for fine cloth, for glass beads, for weapons etched with foreign craft. Some disappeared into lands where their names were never spoken again. Others lived on, their labour woven invisibly into the fortunes of masters who never swung an axe in battle themselves. The wealth of the Viking Age, the silver buried in hoards, the ships that dazzled with carved prows, was not only the fruit of raiding, but of bargaining lives away in quiet markets. And when sacrifice loomed, flesh again became currency. The gods did not deal in silver. Their price was blood, and the masters paid it not from their own veins, but from those bound beneath them. A thrall led to the sacred grove was a bargain struck between man and the divine, a promise made visible in the spilling of life. To question it was unthinkable. Fear ensured compliance, not only among the enslaved, but among the free, who knew that even they could be chosen if fortune turned. Bargains with the gods had no safe boundaries, only the shifting tides of power and belief. The chains of such bargains were not always visible. Sometimes they were words whispered in the dark, a threat spoken softly, a promise of what would happen if duty faltered. Other times they were carved into flesh by the mark of a lash, leaving scars that testified to failed negotiations. Yet most often they lay in silence. The silence of a thrall who did not resist. The silence of a master who looked away when payment was taken from another's body instead of his own. Fear was not loud, it was quiet, steady, a presence felt even when no one spoke of it. As seasons turned, bargains shifted with them. In times of plenty, a thrall might be granted scraps of kindness, not from compassion, but calculation, to preserve strength, to extend usefulness. In famine, flesh became cheaper. Hands that once tilled the earth were now mouths that consumed grain, and the bargain tipped swiftly toward disposal. A slave who fetched silver in summer might be sold for nothing in winter. Fear deepened as the frost did, until even the strongest knew survival was not secured by labour alone, but by the whim of those who owned them. In the stillness of night, when fires dwindled and halls fell silent, these bargains lingered. Masters lay awake, measuring loyalty they could never truly buy. Thralls curled into corners, measuring breaths they could not claim as their own. Flesh and fear alike had been rendered into currency, and the debt was endless. For in the Viking world, survival was not only a contest with hunger and cold, it was a marketplace where lives themselves were weighed, traded, and spent. Silver melted, words faded, but bargains carved into flesh endured, etched deeper than runes, leaving their mark long after both buyer and bought had turned to earth. The crack of the oar against calloused hands was not merely a test of strength, but a reminder that the sea offered no mercy to those bound upon it. To many who found themselves chained along the benches of a longship, the wide expanse of water looked at first glance like the promise of freedom. Beyond the fjord, the horizon stretched endlessly, a road without tracks, a space where no walls enclosed and no master's hall loomed overhead. Yet this promise was a cruel mirage. The sea in the north was not a path of escape, but a cage without bars, a shifting, endless plain where the only choice was to row or to sink. The longship itself was a prison disguised as glory. Its carved prow, shaped into dragons and serpents, cut through waves as though daring the sea to resist. For the masters, it was a symbol of conquest, of journeys that reached distant shores. For those forced to row, it was a place where chains rattled in rhythm with the strokes of the oars. The benches were narrow, slick with salt and sweat, and the air was filled with the heavy breath of men labouring in unison. Each pull on the oar was measured not in distance gained, but in pain endured. The sea demanded obedience, not only from the slaves, but from all aboard. The wind shifted without warning, storms rose with little sign, and the cold pierced through fur and skin alike. But while the free men at the helm could step back from the oar to rest or command, the thrall had no such relief. Their labour was constant, and their exhaustion irrelevant. If an oar slowed, the lash corrected it. If hands bled, the salt water stung them raw until the skin split further. To falter was not to invite sympathy, but to risk being cast aside. Weight on a ship could not be wasted, and mouths that failed to row were mouths unworthy of food. Escape into the sea itself was no salvation. The waters were colder than memory could hold, swallowing breath in moments. Even the strongest swimmer would find no refuge beyond the hull, only waves that pulled downward into silence. Those who thought to leap for freedom discovered instead a grave. The sea did not distinguish between master and slave. It claimed all with equal hunger. For the enslaved, this was the cruelest truth. The very thing that seemed vast enough to carry them away was the same force that bound them tighter than any rope. There were nights, when the stars pierced the dark sky, that silence fell across the longship. The waves rocked the vessel, and the world seemed to stretch into infinity. A thrall might look upward, past the glimmer of constellations, and wonder whether freedom could exist in places unseen, beyond coasts yet unraided. But such thoughts were dangerous. Hope was as heavy as any chain, and in the north, hope could drown a man faster than water. Better to keep eyes low, hands steady, and breath shallow, for dreams had little place in the rhythm of the oars. Masters knew this well. They understood that the sea itself was their accomplice. To own a thrall on land required vigilance, walls, locks, watchful eyes. But on the water, the endless horizon served as the strongest chain. No one ran across the waves. No one slipped silently into freedom, even in port. Escape was fleeting. The world was smaller than it seemed, villages tied by rumour and trade, and a runaway would find himself recognised, hunted, or sold again. The sea carried stories faster than it carried men, and every shore had ears to hear them. Sometimes entire journeys were built upon the traffic of flesh. Ships left the fjords laden not with silver but with people, bound for markets where buyers waited. These voyages were heavy with silence, the kind that settled into bones and made every creak of the hull feel like a tolling bell. Each wave pushed the enslaved further from the land of their birth, yet not closer to freedom, only deeper into the unknown. On such journeys, the sea was not a road, but a knife, cutting ties with the past while opening no doors to the future. Even the free aboard the longship bore unease, though they cloaked it in command. They knew that should storm or misfortune strike, the sea would swallow all equally. But fear sharpened their authority. A master who feared drowning became harsher, more insistent that oars bite deeper into the water, that sails be trimmed perfectly, that thralls obey without pause. The sea demanded control, and control was extracted from those who had none to give. And yet, within this world of water and wood, there were moments that revealed the sharp edge of human will. A thrall who sang softly under his breath, keeping rhythm for the oar beside him. Another who fixed his gaze not on the waves, but on the distant line of land, even if it lay only as a faint shadow. Small gestures, fragile as foam, but defiant in their persistence. The sea might promise no escape, but it also bore witness to these flickers of endurance, moments when the chain could not wholly silence the spirit. Still, endurance was not freedom. When the ship reached harbour, when the ropes were thrown onto foreign docks and anchors dug into silt, the thralls stepped off the ship, no less bound than when they boarded. The sea had carried them across worlds, but never into their own. The longship's journey ended where another master's command began. and the cycle renewed itself, endless as the tides. For those who lived within this system, the sea remained both awe and terror. To the masters, it was the path to riches, the stage for glory. To the enslaved, it was a wall stretching in every direction, one that mocked the very thought of escape. The sea shimmered with promise, but its depths whispered the truth. Once bound to the oar, there was no horizon wide enough to carry you free. The waters of the north gave life, and took it with equal ease. They fed villages with fish, carried ships to distant markets, and swallowed those who dared defy them. And for the thrall, they spoke with a single voice, cold and unyielding, a voice that said there would be no running, no hiding, no breaking away. The sea stretched vast and infinite, but for those chained upon it, it was nothing more than the endless repetition of strokes on an oar, a promise of freedom that dissolved like foam upon the waves. Justice in the Viking world was not carried out in courts with scrolls and seals. It lived in the weight of wood and iron, in the sharpened edge that gleamed beneath the northern sun. An axe was not only a tool for war or woodcutting, it was judgment itself, swung without hesitation, and its verdict was final. For those enslaved, and often even for the free, the axe became a silent arbiter, deciding who would rise from punishment and who would be carved away from the living. Disobedience rarely needed to be great to invite its attention. A thrall who failed to carry out a command, who faltered at an oar, or who allowed exhaustion to overcome him during the harvest. Such lapses did not call for debate. A master's patience was not a boundless resource, and in a world where strength meant survival, weakness was treated as betrayal. Punishments could take many forms: lashes, starvation, humiliation, but when patience frayed completely, the axe ended the matter. It was not simply death that made the axe feared, but the swiftness of its decisions. One moment, a man might be chained to labour, and the next, he might be forced to kneel in the dirt, his neck bent beneath the judgment of iron. There were no lengthy speeches, no prayers for reprieve. The strike was its own ceremony. The blow fell, the body dropped, and the ground darkened with blood. The sound of it lingered. A single swing, a dull thud, the hush that followed. Thralls who witnessed such justice learned lessons without words. The masters did not need to explain authority. The axe spoke fluently in silence. It reminded every watcher that survival depended not on hope or faith, but on obedience. The weight of fear spread wider than the blade itself, carving into the minds of all who lived beneath its shadow. The free men, too, felt the presence of that edge. A chieftain who lost honour, a warrior who betrayed trust, a thief who broke the bonds of community, all could find themselves beneath the same stroke. Blood was the great equaliser, though the paths to it differed. For the enslaved, it came swiftly, often without chance of defence. For the free, it arrived through judgment at the Thingstead, where neighbours gathered, disputes aired, and sentences passed. Yet even in such assemblies, the end was the same. The axe, heavy in a man's grip, descending with the authority of law and vengeance combined. Fear of the axe did not always manifest as resistance. More often, it sank into daily life as an unspoken understanding. A thrall bent lower when commanded. Hands moved faster at tasks. Voices fell quieter. They did not speak of rebellion, not because the thought never stirred, but because they knew how rebellion ended. The axe was patient. It needed only one excuse. The masters carried their own burden in this. To rule by the axe was to live in constant readiness to wield it. Authority could not be allowed to waver. A show of mercy might be read as weakness, and weakness invited danger. So the blade stayed sharp, and its memory was kept alive in the minds of all who served. Yet each strike also deepened unease. For every thrall cut down, others remained to carry the story, to hold the silence that stretched between them like a taut cord. Masters ruled, but they too felt the edge of the judgment they imposed. There were rituals too in the swing of the axe. At times it was not punishment, but sacrifice, when a thrall was chosen to appease the gods. In such moments, the blade was not only an instrument of death, but a bridge between mortal and divine. Blood spilled onto soil was thought to bind men and gods together, sealing bargains with a life that was not the master's own. The thrall who died thus did not pass into silence alone. His blood was woven into the story of the community, a thread of fear and reverence. Yet whether as punishment or offering, the axe never lost its hunger. It chose without hesitation, without mercy, without appeal. Its edge was indifferent to whether a man cried, begged, or stood silent. Once raised, its decision was already made. And so, the villagers of the north grew accustomed to living with its presence. Children saw it leaned against walls, used to split wood in daylight, then carried with the same ease into darker ceremonies at night. Women prepared meals while knowing it might be used, before sunset, to end a life. Thralls laboured within earshot of its ringing strike. It was not hidden away or softened by words. It was as common a part of life as the fire in the hearth. The memory of each death endured long after the blood was washed from the ground. A stump in the yard, marked by the grain of iron's bite. A patch of earth that grass seemed slow to reclaim. The smell of wood darkened by old stains. These were reminders left in plain sight, not meant to be forgotten. The axe itself demanded remembrance, its silence louder than any tale spoken aloud. And when a thrall looked at the blade, leaned casually in a corner, or strapped at a master's side, he saw more than a weapon. He saw the border between life endured and life ended, a line drawn not by his choice, but by another's whim. The axe did not need to swing each day to maintain its hold. Its promise was enough. The sea might have denied escape, but on land it was the axe that closed the final door. In a world where survival was measured in strength and obedience, mercy was rare, and judgment came swiftly. The axe did not ask, did not weigh, did not forgive. It chose, and in choosing, it reminded all who lived in the Viking Age that life was never truly their own to keep. When the axe had finished its judgment, or when sickness and exhaustion carried away those who could not endure, the unfree met their end without the honours sung for others. Death, in the Viking world, was never just an ending. It was a statement about who you were, what you had earned, and how the living would remember you. For the thrall, the grave was yet another reminder of his place, as sharp and unyielding as the chains he wore in life. Burial was not a single practice, but a reflection of rank and worth. Chieftains might be laid in ships with weapons, jewels, and feasts of meat and mead to carry them toward Valhalla or the halls of their ancestors. Warriors might rest with their swords, their shields, and their stories, remembered in sagas and whispered around the hearth. Even merchants were sent off with the trappings of trade, scales, weights, goods that testified to their journeys. But for the unfree, there was no poetry in the grave. A thrall's body was often lowered into the earth with little more than the clothes he died in, if even those. No treasures marked his passing, for he owned nothing that could be buried. No family wept openly, for his kin had long been stripped from him, scattered or forgotten. The ground closed around him with the indifference of soil filling a hole. His death was not a story to be told, but a task to be finished. Sometimes there was not even that. In places where land was too precious to waste on slaves, bodies might be cast aside, buried in shallow pits, or left at the edge of fields. Their presence was known only by the dark stains in the earth, uncovered centuries later by archaeologists puzzled by bones without adornment. These graves tell of lives endured without recognition, of endings that came without ceremony. And yet, silence itself became part of the ritual. The absence of songs, the lack of offerings, the hurried way the earth was packed down, all of it was deliberate. The thrall's life had been lived in service, and his death was no different. Even in the grave, he served a purpose, a reminder to the living of what it meant to fall outside honour, outside kinship, outside remembrance. There were moments, however, when death blurred the boundaries. Archaeologists have found thralls buried alongside their masters, not as companions, but as part of the master's wealth carried into death. A favourite servant, a concubine, or a labourer considered useful might be slain and laid beside the body, bound forever to serve in the afterlife as they had in life. For the master, it was an assertion of power even in death. For the thrall, it was bondage that did not end with the closing of the grave. In some graves, signs of violence linger in the bones, necks broken, skulls split, ribs pierced. These were not deaths by chance. They were chosen endings, sacrifices folded into funerary rites. The master's journey to the next world demanded attendance, and the axe or blade ensured that the unfree followed. The burial mound rose over both, but the stories told afterward remembered only the master's name. The thrall's blood watered the soil, and his silence endured beneath it. To stand at such a burial was to feel the divide between freedom and bondage in its starkest form. The mourners gathered, voices low, songs rising for the honoured dead. Torches flickered, smoke drifted into the evening air. Around the pyre or the mound, the community remembered, retold, reaffirmed. But when the moment came for the thrall, there was no gathering, no voice to carry his memory. His death was marked by absence, and that absence was its own kind of presence. For the thralls who remained, watching such endings deepened the knowledge they carried in silence. Life was not theirs to shape, and death would not redeem them. There was no promise of Valhalla, no hall of mead and feasting, no place among the honoured ancestors. At best, their spirits were imagined to wander nameless, untethered, shadows without songs. At worst, they were forgotten completely, their bones merging into the earth until only the soil remembered. Yet the masters needed even these unmarked graves. Fear lived not only in the axe, but in the ground itself. Every thrall who saw another hurried into the earth without ceremony was reminded of his place. To live was to serve, to die was to vanish. And so obedience was bound not only by the threat of punishment in life, but by the certainty of obscurity in death. Still, death had its quiet rebellions. A thrall might whisper his own name into the air before the final blow, hoping the wind would carry it somewhere beyond the grave. Another might cling to fragments of old faiths, imagining a return to the gods of his homeland, rather than submission to the cold silence of a foreign soil. Some perhaps dreamed that in death the bonds would finally break, that no master's voice could command them, no axe could reach them. The graves left behind show none of these hopes, but the silence they hold may carry echoes that words cannot recover. And so the earth of the north grew heavy with bones of the unfree, hidden beneath fields, forests, and villages. Each unmarked grave was a shadow beneath the grand mounds of chiefs and warriors, a quiet balance to the songs of glory. The saga of the Vikings was sung loudly, but beneath it ran another story, hushed, buried, and forgotten. The story of those whose lives were measured in toil, and whose deaths were measured in silence. The burial of the unfree was not an oversight, nor neglect born of haste. It was part of the order, as intentional as the weight of chains or the swing of the axe. By denying memory, by erasing ceremony, the masters ensured that the thrall's place was fixed not only in life, but in death. The grave closed around them as it had closed around their voices, leaving nothing but earth, silence, and a warning to those who still lived. The day's labours ended not with rest, but with a dimming of light that pressed heavily against the world. As the sun slid low, the fjord gathered its silence, a mirror of black water stretching between the ridges of stone and pine. The air cooled sharply, breath curling like smoke, while the distant cry of a seabird marked the last trace of daylight. In this quiet, the lives of the unfree remained tethered to the will of their masters, for even the night could not be claimed as wholly their own. The farms along the fjord's edge seemed peaceful in the dark, their fires glowing faintly through narrow openings in the timber walls. Yet beneath that glow, the rhythm of power endured. Masters gathered inside longhouses, their voices carried over mugs of mead, songs lifted with laughter or heavy with story. The thralls lingered on the threshold of such sounds, their bodies still aching from the day, their hands raw, their hunger dulled by thin portions. They crouched in the corners, in huts apart from the hearth, or in the barns among livestock, where warmth came not from fire, but from the breath of animals pressed close. Night was a liminal space for them. In the dark, a thrall's thoughts turned inward, for speech was dangerous, and silence was safer. A whispered word could echo too loudly in a hall where every ear belonged to the master's authority. And so, the night around the fjord held not just silence, but a silence filled with weight, the weight of words unsaid, of memories that could not be shared, of fears that coiled more tightly when the world was dark. Sometimes the silence was broken not by voices but by ritual. On certain nights, when the sky seemed swollen with stars, or when the moon hung low like a polished blade, the masters would call for offerings. Torches flared against the dark, shadows shivering across the carved god poles that watched over the fjords. Fires were built high, their sparks carried into the night wind. Animals were brought forward, throats cut so their blood might soak the earth or stain the wood of the altar. The thralls stood near, holding the ropes, carrying buckets, dragging carcasses when commanded. Their hands smelled of iron and ash, and their eyes reflected the firelight without daring to linger too long on the gods, or the men who called themselves favoured by them. These rituals pulled night into a shape unlike the quiet hours of labour. The air itself seemed to tremble with smoke and chanting. Sometimes there was singing, sometimes the dull beat of a drum, its rhythm steady as a heartbeat. The fjord's water mirrored the flames, so that fire seemed to burn both on land and on sea. But when the chanting ended, and the flames sank to embers, the silence returned heavier, as though the fjord itself had drawn a breath, and then held it. For the unfree, the silence after ritual was harder than the noise during it. The gods had been fed, the masters satisfied, yet the thralls remained, their bodies weary and their stomachs still thin. They carried the refuse away, swept the blood from the stones, smothered the last of the fire. And in doing so, they erased themselves. By dawn, no trace of their labour would remain, only the memory of the master's devotion. Yet silence was never complete. From the barns, one might hear the lowing of cattle or the shifting of horses. From the shoreline came the lap of water against the rocks, the steady rhythm of the tide that had watched countless nights before. And always there was the sound of breathing, the huddled breath of thralls pressed together for warmth, the laboured breath of the old and sick. the uneven breath of those dreaming fitfully. Night did not stop these sounds. It wrapped them in darkness, giving them no audience but the fjord itself. The masters believed that silence too was a form of order. By controlling speech, by pressing labour into the hours of daylight and obedience into the hours of night, they ensured that even rest became a tool of dominance. The thrall who closed his eyes did so not in peace, but in surrender, his dreams bound by the day to come. The fjord's silence was never freedom. It was simply another form of command, but the silence could not fully erase the weight of memory. In the quiet, the thrall might remember faces long lost, voices that spoke in tongues no longer heard along the fjord. Perhaps, too, he remembered rivers wider than these, fields brighter than these, or nights where the stars did not seem so sharp and cold. These memories did not rebel loudly, but they persisted, like stones buried beneath soil, unseen yet always present. Still, morning always came. The silence of the fjord gave way to the sound of oars dipping into water, of roosters calling, of footsteps on frozen ground. The fires within longhouses were stoked, the masters stirred, and the cycle began again. What had been whispered to the night dissolved with the frost. What had been remembered in silence was carried like a hidden ember, unseen by those who demanded obedience. To imagine yourself here is to imagine not just work and hunger, but the weight of silence itself. Daytime chains clinked with iron and wood. Nighttime chains were woven from quiet. The fjord, still and vast, seemed to conspire in this order, holding the weight of the world in its dark water. And if you stood at its edge, watching the moon ripple across its surface, you might feel how silence itself could suffocate, how even the air seemed owned by those who commanded. Nightfall over the silent fjord was no rest, no refuge. It was another page in the ledger of control, a space where the unfree learned that even darkness could be bent to authority. The quiet stretched long, broken only by the water's lap and the distant crackle of embers fading to ash. And in that stillness, the fjord seemed to keep its secrets well, the songs unspoken, the tears unshed. The weight of lives lived beneath the surface, hidden in the silence where no master cared to look. The night drifts with us to its end, and so too does our quiet journey. We walked through a settlement not of legend, but of weight. A place where dawn began without comfort, where hunger lingered longer than bread, where the hands of thralls shaped every corner of life, yet received no thanks in return. We felt the sharpness of cold mornings, the burden of buckets filled with water, the ache of backs bent in fields and forges. We stood at the edges of feasts, watching meat and mead pass by, and we carried the scraps that were left. We saw the shrines where gods demanded offerings, and we knew the role of those forced to drag, to clean, to obey. The rhythm was not one of song or saga, but of silence. The silence of labour, the silence of hunger, the silence of sleep that gave no rest. And this, perhaps more than the clash of swords or the voyage of ships, is what life truly held for so many who lived under Viking rule. So, as your eyes grow heavier and your breath falls slower, ask yourself, could you endure that cycle of cold, hunger, and exhaustion? Could you find strength in a life where nothing belonged to you, not even your dawn, not even your rest? These are the quiet truths that lie beneath the stories of warriors and gods. And in remembering them, we let the forgotten voices speak again, softly, across the centuries. If you found calm in this wandering through the past, let it carry you into sleep. And before you drift fully into dreams, take a moment to subscribe. It helps these small histories travel farther to more night tables, to more quiet hours, where others too might find rest in stories that are not loud but still alive. Until next time, may your night be gentler than theirs was, and may the dawn that greets you bring warmth, not burden.